Imagine this scenario. You're in the middle of teaching your Bible story when you notice Sarah and her friend begin to whisper together and laugh. Anthony leans in and whispers to them, "Hey, what's so funny?" You remind the students to have a zero voice, but then a few minutes later, Chris shouts out, "Hey, Miss, Sarah keeps poking me in the back." The entire class turns to look at the girls. Well, to many teachers, leaders, and educators, this kind of scenario sounds very familiar. In this video, you will learn some tips and strategies to help you feel more empowered to handle challenging behaviors. Our first set of strategies have to do with the classroom structure. First of all, you will need clear expectations. Author, professor, and speaker Brene Brown says, "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind," and this applies to our students as well. Students need to be very clear on what you expect of their behavior in club. Do not expect students to know how to behave. Your expectations should be between 3 to 5 simple words or phrases, and students should know what these look like, sound like, and feel like. In a few minutes, we will look at some example expectations. Next, make sure to have clear consequences. And these consequences should be things that you can actually follow through with. Sometimes it's even fun to include students in your conversation about different consequences for certain behaviors. Some example consequences include talking with parents after club, writing a reflection note, or even sitting out of an activity for a few minutes or the whole activity. It's also important to remember that giving students a warning can be really successful. This way, students can take time to reflect and change their behavior before they get a consequence. Next, make sure you define your routines and structures for a club. How do you expect students to go from small group to whole group? Where should they go? How long should it take? What should their voice level be at? Make sure you define these routines, and once you do, practice them with your students. Practice and practice again until they get it right. This leads into our final strategy, which is holding students accountable. In the example of practicing routines, it is important to hold students accountable to these routines, even if you're 3 weeks in and they mess it up. Practice it again. If you continue to hold students accountable to the routines and structures, they will learn to respect your rules and to follow your expectations. The second example with following routines is with conversation. Many times, teachers want their students to be silent and listen when they're giving directions or teaching, or if another student is addressing the group. So if you expect them to be quiet, get their attention, and then wait. Wait until everybody is silent. Then you can begin to give directions and teach. If you begin to talk over students while giving directions or teaching, the students will learn that you don't actually want them to have a silent voice when you're speaking. Lastly, with holding students accountable, make sure you really do follow through with those consequences. If you decide you want to change your mind about something, make sure you talk with the student before you change the consequence. Now that we've talked about strategies about your classroom structure, let's talk about strategies that have to do with addressing the actual behavior. The first important thing to remember when addressing behavior is to use a firm but calm and kind voice. Just like we as adults want to be respected, kids want to be respected too. So when you talk with them about their behavior, again, use a firm but calm and kind voice. This will show them that you respect them and that you care about them. Next, when addressing behavior, you might want to decide between either a whole class reminder or a private conference with the student. Sometimes it's easy for teachers to call students out in front of the entire class. However, when we do this, it can create feelings of distrust and embarrassment in the student. So instead, think about giving a whole class reminder. For example, class, the expectation is 0 voice. Or find a time to have a private conference with that student. You can also use verbal signals. That way you can communicate with students about what you want them to do without actually taking time and stopping to speak with them. Also, make sure you celebrate student success. If you notice a group of students, the entire class, or one student doing something great, take time to celebrate them. In a few minutes, we will learn some example celebrations. Lastly, communicate with their parents. If we communicate with parents about their behavior, both positive and negative behavior, students will learn that we are always talking with their families, and this adds an additional layer of accountability to students' behavior. Now that we've learned some strategies for addressing challenging behavior, let's look at some examples. First, let's look at some clear expectations. As you can see on this chart, the expectations are along the left-hand side. There are 3 expectations: be safe, be respectful, and be responsible. It also might be a good idea to talk with your school personnel. This way, your expectations can be the same as the ones in school, and students will already be familiar with these expectations. Once you begin club, make sure you go through this chart with students, creating it together. Ask students, what does it look like to be safe? What does it sound like to be safe? And what do we feel like when we are in a safe environment? Next, we have an example of a transition routine. As you can see, this routine is done in 30 seconds. It has 4 steps. Have a 0 voice, stand up and push your chair in, walk to your spot, and sit crisscross. Lastly, wait at a 0 voice for directions. Once you've explained the routine, model it for students, have some other students model it, and then practice with the entire group. Now we have some example nonverbal signals. The signals on the top row are signals you can use as a teacher to tell students what you would like them to do. The bottom row are example signals that students can show you for what they need without actually having to interrupt the club activities. Earlier, we talked about the strategy about praising students when they are successful. So, whenever you see students, a group of students, or the entire class doing something great, make sure to pause and celebrate that success with some cheers. Let's look at some example cheers together. The first is, "You're great," and it goes like this. "You're great, 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 great," like we're grating cheese. The second celebration is the roller coaster, and it goes like this. Woo, woo, woo. Next, we have "You rock." You rock. We also have "Raise the roof." Whoop, whoop. And lastly, we have "Round of applause." Kids also love getting involved with creating their own cheers, and this will really help them be excited about receiving these cheers in class. Now that we've learned some strategies and we have looked at some examples, let's go back to Sarah's situation. So remember, Sarah and her friend are whispering together, and then Chris shouts out in front of everybody that Sarah has been poking him. So pause the video and think, how would you handle Sarah's behavior? There are many different options you can use to address Sarah's behavior, but let's talk about 2. The first option would be more of a whole class reminder. You could pause and remind the students of the expectation. For example, remember everyone, the expectation is that we are safe, respectful, and responsible, which means we keep our hands to ourselves and we have a 0 voice. Then wait for everybody to meet that expectation and move on. At the end of the lesson, you can then talk to Sarah and her friend and praise them for getting their behavior turned around. At the end of club, you can talk to Sarah's parents and tell them how great she did pulling her behavior back together. The second option is to have a private conference with Sarah and her friend. You could give a discussion prompt to the class and have them talk together while you pull Sarah and her friend off to the side. In your mini conference, you can remind Sarah and her friend of the expectation and then maybe give them a couple options. Say, you guys can either take a break at the calming down corner and reflect on your choices, pull it back together, and join us when you're ready. Or if you're ready to join us again now, please come and have a seat. In this way, Sarah and her friend can take a break if they need it, or if they just needed that quick reminder and they're ready to go, well, they can join again. Again, after the lesson, make sure to praise Sarah and her friend for pulling their behavior together, and then talk with their parents after club. Now that you've practiced, let's review the strategies we've learned together. First, make sure you set clear consequences and clear expectations, and that you define your routines. Don't forget to hold students accountable to those routines. Next, when you address student behavior, make sure to use a firm but kind and loving voice. Then think about if you want to give a whole group reminder or have a private conference. And don't forget to communicate with parents, because this will really help hold students accountable to their behavior. These strategies we've learned today will generally be successful with most students. There are a lot of strategies, so don't be overwhelmed. Just take one or two to use at first. Once you get more comfortable using the different strategies, add on another one. In this way, you will be able to reduce challenging behaviors in your classroom and have an energetic, engaging, and respectful learning environment.